And thanks for staying with us here on the Joy News channel. This is The Pulse. It's time now to talk about Momo, because government has unveiled plans to substantially overhaul the controversial electronic transfer levy as part of its medium-term revenue strategy. The strategy is aimed at revamping and optimizing the taxation policy for a greater efficiency and also effectiveness. Now, in May 2022, the deeply unpopular tax on mobile money transactions, known as the E-Levy, was introduced. When it was introduced, the levy was restructured from the 1.5%, as we know it, to a broad stroke of, 1% as we have it now. However, in January, we know that government is taking that decision of making it a generic percentage for every transaction that you do. Now, a whole new design, as we understand, is in store for this very revenue measure. So what's in store, and possibly what are the changes that are likely to happen? Isaac of EHA's data analyst there at Joy News, joining us with the very latest on all of that. For me, if you ask me, just take all of this off. Let's do our more transaction in peace. But why is a restructuring critical to government at this moment?
Well, it has to do with what we call the target versus the actual outturn. And so this is a revenue measure. And so once you put it in your budget that's in a certain specific year, you're going to get about 7 billion. And you end up getting around 500 million. It tells you
so this is the target initially, 6.9 billion.
That was 2022, 6.9, almost 7 billion.
Yeah, government revised that
to 611 million Ghana cedis. Then the provisional outturn at the end of 2022 was somewhere around 592.11 million Ghana cedis.
That's way below the initial projection.
It's below the initial projection
6.9
and even the revised projection.
Yeah.
So that tells you that, just do the math, 6.96 billion Ghana cedis minus almost, let's say, 600 million Ghana cedis. That's a huge gap.
Yeah.
More than 4 billion Ghana cedis was not actually achieved. So that tells you that then you are beginning to increase your budget deficit, because this revenue was supposed to come in to close that gap. And that is why you make that target of 7 billion, hoping that you get maybe at least 5.5 or 5.4 so that you can close it. But once you start getting way below your target, then you must redesign. Then you must look at the implementation process and all of those things. 2023, this year, for instance, if you look at the first quarter figures and how much we targeted to get in the first quarter, 413 million Ghana cedis. Looking at the provisional data from the Ministry of Finance, we've been able to get just 216 of that amount. It means that we got close to 50% less than what we even projected to get in the first quarter of this year. Let's go to the second quarter of this year and see if we perform well in that quarter.
That's for the same 2023, where we are as
exactly. The target was more than half a billion.
8.9.
Exactly, and we just got 239.
So the trend is clear that we're not making progress in terms of the projected revenue raking, and how government tends to make much more gains from the E-Levy policy. Which means probably that if government is going to do a review, they are either going to throw everything off completely or increase their rate.
So this review, in essence, is supposed to help reach the target. So if you are reaching the target, then you have to look at all the indicators. If you look at this revenue that we are getting versus the mobile money participation, and I was looking at the data, and you see the number of merchants, mobile money vendors, the number has reduced. And you see also the number of active mobile money accounts going up and all of those things. So people are doing transactions, but they're finding ways and means around the system. So government must find a certain net to bring everybody into the fold again, to make sure that they get the target that they want. At least, even if there will be a deviation, it should not be as huge or as wide as this deviation that we see. And it's all because it's part of our IMF program. By September, last month, we were supposed to make sure that we review our statutory funds and also make sure that our revenues coming in will be much higher than what we even had the previous year. And once you start getting these shocks from, very, very important revenue, measures like the E-Levy, then it tells you that you may not meet your revenue target.
Okay, so what you're invariably telling us is that the IMF conditionalities will practically make it impossible for government to throw away the E-Levy at this moment.
Not at all.
That's not happening.
A complete, scrapping of the E-Levy is not an option. That's why government maybe use the word redesign. Redesign in the sense that they are going to restructure it to make sure that they get the best out of it. When this was introduced, people were trying to bring in their inputs, but government wanted it to be done in a certain way. We've gone ahead with it, and now we've seen that you can't probably force everything on the people. They'll find ways and means around it. So government is now it's been more than a year and I think 8 months. So it's a good period. It's a good we have good data set to now look at the data and see where government is at fault, where government will have to go in and then make sure that...
Okay, it's critical that you're raising this IMF position because the minority in Parliament has been speaking about this. We'll get to that for you shortly as to what it is that the minority feels about this and then bring in Kweku Asante, who is a parliamentary correspondent, because there's a lot developing on the story with the minority in Parliament making clear suggestions on what they feel the impact of this has been on the economy. Well, Isaac, just come through on this point for us again. In terms of, the considerations of this strategy that government may be considering, what's likely to be the next step in terms of going about the review?
Well, so review, in my opinion, if you look at the rates, government probably will not, bring down the rate again because the rate has been reduced. I think this will be the second. If government does any review, this will be the third. And the current 1%, if government does anything to the rate, if they increase the rate to a certain amount, then it means that telcos must also be compelled to reduce their rate, of which I'm not sure they are ready to do. So government will find ways and means to make sure that they come to equilibrium at a point where the rate that they will be charging will not influence the rate that the telcos will also be charging. Because once government increases their rates and telcos are forced to reduce their rates, it goes ahead to also affect their revenue. And government cannot also go ahead to reduce because even with this 1% or whatever rate government is charging, they are not able to get the target. And so it's a very dicey, permutation and combination for government at this point where they have to find ways and means to reach an equilibrium point where telcos have what they want and government also have what they want, and even the citizen who are also paying the levy also have what they want.
The minority in Parliament has been speaking on this. In fact, they're accusing government of Ghana of placing citizens under severe economic stress with the introduction of the taxes such as the E-Levy and then the hike in the utility tariffs as we've seen. According to the minority spokesperson on finance, Isaac Adongo, all the key economic indicators like inflation, interest rate, and economic growth have all worsened compared to what they stood as of last year. We'll go into the figures shortly, but this situation, the minority believes, is making Ghanaians worse off. They've been addressing a press briefing on this matter. Listen.
What they have sought to do is to compare mangoes with pineapples. You can't take end-year inflation of 2022 and compare it to any of the inflation other than December 2023. That is how you compare apples to apples. Because the inflation that you find in any period, year on year, is compared to the same period the previous year. And we are not in December. The inflation we are seeing today has different seasonal and cyclical pressures compared to that of December. In December, we all know the demand pressures. We know Christmas comes. There's a lot of pressure on the cedi because people are looking for foreign currency to stock for Christmas and all of that. The inflation of now has not experienced that. So you can't compare that to the inflation that would be attained in December. Again, you can't compare food inflation in a period of harvest to food inflation in a period of planting. They are two completely different things altogether. So I just want you to understand that the comparison they are doing, using in-period inflation to compare to December and clap for themselves, is an act of futility. That is not what they were taught. And nobody was taught that. So we will compare like to like. In June 2022, when we were in the worst situation, inflation as of June was 29.8%. In 2023, with IMF in the boats, and we're expecting things to get better, it worsened to 31.7%. In July 2022, when things were worse, as we were made to believe, inflation was 31.7%. But with IMF in 2023, July inflation was 43.1%. August inflation, as of 2022, was 33.9%. For 2023 with IMF, it's 40.1%. The latest month is September of 2022 was 37.2. It is now 43.1%. How do you look Ghanaians in their face and tell them when they are losing this rapid deterioration in their purchasing power that there's a turnaround?
Well, so that's Isaac Adongo addressing the press earlier today, and he talks about the indicators not favoring us as of this moment.
We'll actually, disagree with Adongo in terms of probably inflation and probably economic growth rates, because although the IMF has maintained our growth rate as 1.5%, there are other organizations that are maintaining a 3% growth rate for the country, looking at the first and second quarter growth rates, which were all above 3%. But it is too early to say that probably the economy has actually turned the corner, because we are still having inflation of 40%. Food inflation is above 50%. Debt to GDP ratio is still very high. We've still not been able to move from assurance stage to agreement stage with our external creditors in our external debt restructuring, where you heard, Stefan Rode, who said that, subsequent disbursement of the IMF money will depend on we agreeing on actual restructuring. And I've always said that there's a template for us to follow. Maybe the IMF will relax some rules for us, but if you are going according to what we know, the IMF, what they do, then Zambia is a perfect case. The first time they got their first tranche, they've not been able to get their second and subsequent ones because they failed to restructure their external debt, which China is a major piece, a significant piece in this whole restructuring process. And Ghana finds itself in that same situation. We've been talking about assurance for over a year. We've not been able to move from assurance to actual restructuring, not to even talk about haircuts. And so it's a very difficult situation for the country at the moment. But, if you talk to government, they say they are hopeful that by the end of the year, they will get 600 million as the second tranche. But I've been looking at the IMF data that they provide, and I get scared when I look at Ghana's balance of payment gap for 2023 to 2026, that we are under an IMF. The balance of the amount we need to make sure that we survive this crisis is $15 billion. And that is just balance of payments.
Yeah. Okay. So it's the reason for which, Isaac Adongo has also been equally making that point in this press briefing. But the IMF appears to be pointing out, and that's where the minority has been trying to compare the figures, trying to suggest that, things are picking up.
Well, things are picking up. Probably you can pick indicators, you can pick and choose indicators. And even if you pick inflation and say we've been able to reduce inflation from 54 to 40% from December to now, 40% inflation, if you compare amongst our peers, we are still very high.
Right.
I just read last week that Ivory Coast had a 3.8 billion, IMF loan. And I checked Ivory Coast inflation and it's still below 10%.
I see.
And there are countries getting IMF loans close more than what we are getting. Morocco is getting more than 3 billion to fight climate change. We are getting 3 billion to do balance of payments. And so if you look at all of these different scenarios and people go ahead to say that, oh, we are getting better, I think it's too early. Because the same thing happened to us when we were ending our 16th IMF program in 2019. We thought everything was right, but the IMF passed a very serious judgment that we all didn't pay attention to in 2019. They told us when they were leaving, they were exiting the 16th IMF program. They told us that our debt levels were highly debt distressed. That was just few months after we were exiting an IMF program. And I still look at the figures and looking at the fact that Ghana would have to go and find additional 10 billion to fund balance of payments. It's too early to say that things are...
Isaac Ofeji, data analyst here at Joy News. Well, the minority spokesperson on finance, Isaac Adongo, believes that the economy is not doing a rebound as suggested by government. Listen.
But we have achieved this after paying more taxes as part of the IMF conditions. We have achieved this with electricity bills more than tripling. In fact, every quarter we experience close to 30% jump. Every quarter. So electricity bills are now almost 4 times what we were paying last year. This is the suffering of Ghanaians. We have achieved this by destroying value of the Ghanaian through a domestic debt exchange program, which did not even spare poor pensioners and vulnerable people in our society. They have had to lose a lot of their investment that they depend on for their survival and even their medication in order for us to escalate inflation to the levels that are worse than we were before the IMF. But even more importantly, we have done this by destroying our banking and financial sector, which has recorded 18 billion loss because of this IMF program. We have done this by going all over the place in the world, cap in hand, applying to be declared bankrupt, and actually begging that we should be issued with a certificate of bankruptcy. That is what we have done. This cannot be good news. And so we expected that at this review, we would have seen some modicum of improvement. We have done this at a point where DDEP created a benchmark interest rate of 9%. And we expected the 9% to dictate interest rate of various financial instruments. Today, the government itself borrows at 32.8% on the short end, just for 91 days. That is ridiculous. That already tells you that the DDEP has failed to signal an appropriate interest rate for Ghanaians. So if government is borrowing at 32.8%, tell me how much Koku and Menu Enterprise will pay? 45, 50%? I don't know the kind of business you will do that you recover that kind of interest rates.